So, title, MTS 504 IEP. What does that stand for again? In education, we tend to use a lot of acronyms, and at times it can be confusing even for us who are in education. And this can be even more frustrating for a parent who comes to you and they simply want their kid to get help. They don't really care what the acronym is or what legal process is governing its procedure or how it's funded. They just want their kid to get help. So if you're an administrator, it's important to understand how these services can create a intervention system that helps all students, because they overlap. There isn't clear transition from one to the other. And if not properly managed, they can kind of provide redundant services and not be super effective. And as a teacher, it can be helpful to understand how they work, how students qualify, and what exactly they get for qualifying for each of the different types, as each one is a little different. Now I'll present these as a continuum, but they really have overlap and they're not clear cut and divided between them. Then briefly, why should you even listen to me? Well, it's a good question, but I have been a 504 and an MTSS coordinator for 8 years, so I'm very familiar with that side of student services. I've also been a school administrator for 8 years and involved in IEP meetings, and I'm currently the president of our special education unit here. So I'm quite involved in that side of it. So I have a fairly good working understanding. If you're watching this, this is designed for kind of an overview of all these things, not a deep dive into special education, but understanding how these different parts work can really pay dividends for effective running school. So now I'll roll into why do we have all these systems? And it's quite simply because student needs are different. And these all came up in order to close up the cracks. So many of you will remember the era of No Child Left Behind, not to bring up that memory, but a lot of those things came about because children would fall through the cracks, as they say. So they developed different programs to meet different needs. So in a well-run school system, 80 to 90% of your children should receive an adequate education from your general education. Now, this does include interventions that you do in the classroom, such as moving students up close, maybe small pullouts that you do for everybody. So it's not just the classroom instruction itself, but like teachers, those of you watching this, or board members, you guys do things to help students succeed within the classroom all the time. You just might not think of it as an intervention. So you have general education, should be meeting 80 to 90% of your children's needs. Then you have special education, which should be targeting 5 to 10%. Now that's just a general rule of thumb. Obviously there's schools with more or less, but like if you're seeing a school where 60% of your students' needs are being met by general education, that signals a problem. Now, where at-risk programs are intended to come into place is that gap in between that general education and special education. For example, 80% of the kids' needs being met, 5% being met with special education, there would be 15% left in there in the middle. So that's just random number thrown together. It varies for every school, and there's overlap. Some of these at-risk programs will serve special education students as well, and obviously it will dip into your general ed population. But for the at-risk is just a term I'm using for this presentation for those programs that have kind of gatekeeping criterion. You don't get English language services just because you have to qualify. You don't get into a gifted and talented program just because you need to qualify. So that's where I'm putting at-risk programming. Now, gifted and talented, they probably don't consider you at risk, but even students in gifted and talented might have needs that fall into special education, as I'll get into earlier. But as I said, these are all designed for making sure that all students get an adequate education. So the purposes for here, I got 3 categories. General education. So what's different from general education from these other ones is that there's no legally binding document involved. Generally, any plans or just a good faith effort upon the school to meet a student's needs. There's generally not a requirement for data tracking. There's certainly not a requirement that a student have certain test scores to receive services of one kind or another. It's just the kind of education you provide to all of your students. So I want to emphasize, I said all, not your general ed minus your special ed, all of your students. At-risk programming is really kind of that programming that's targeted at kids that are often called bubble kids. They don't have a specific learning disability, but they're not on grade level, they're behind grade level. And you know, the at-risk term came along because if they continue to fall behind, they'll get farther and farther behind until they can't catch up. Maybe they then need special education program. They're at risk, in other words. As I said before, like at-risk programming has qualifications. They're generally not as strict as special education. They don't need to show a learning disability. They just need to show a need. They have a need for language services. They have a need for additional instruction to catch up to the rest of the children in the class. But there isn't a need for the criterion to qualify are different. Special education, really in a nutshell, is what that term is, special. The student needs specialized instruction. They need services from specialized instructors. And this really comes into the play of having an appropriate education. If you're in special education, that means that the general education is not entirely appropriate for you. So we need to do something different in order to meet your needs. Now, in North Dakota, generally, students are going to qualify as having a learning disability. Now, there are other categories such as social, emotional, sensory, and other disorders, but generally the requirements to receive an IEP just for those things are rather high, and you don't see a lot of them. You certainly see plenty of special education plans that address behavior and social needs and stuff, but they didn't qualify because of those. So just an important note there that you know, in North Dakota, if you're trying to pursue qualifying for special education because of extreme behaviors, just be aware that that criterion to meet is rather high. And so most are qualified on specific learning disabilities. So an important aspect of special education is that it falls under IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Act. So this is a federal program, and what it relates to that having an appropriate education. It also protects individuals with disabilities to make sure they're receiving adequate services to meet their needs. And as I said, most students will qualify as having a learning disability. So, specific note, a learning disability is a discrepancy between somebody's ability and their performance. So like a student can be gifted and qualify as needing special services, or a student on the flip side could have very low ability but not qualify for special education because there isn't a discrepancy between their performance and their ability. So, you know, just because a student gets labeled with an IEP does not make them dumb. I just kind of want to make a point of that their needs are different is what that means. And so because of IDEA, you know, things like supplement but not supplant, and maintenance and effort and those sorts of things come into play. So that gets me into my point on what is not a learning disability. So you have ADHD, dyslexia, autism, epilepsy, ODD, nearsighted. All these are examples of things that do not qualify you for special education. That's because they're not a learning disability. Now I'll use dyslexia for example. If you remove reading from somebody that's only dyslexic, a lot of times they have very adequate ability to read, or even very high functioning possibly. You know, if you present the information orally or otherwise, they follow on just fine, they do well. Their trouble is with reading. Now, you know, a lot of students with dyslexia can qualify as having a reading disability, you know, a specific learning issue with reading, but dyslexia in and of itself isn't a qualifying criterion in North Dakota. Similarly, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a problem with attention, not learning, because the child can't regulate their attention, they miss things. But if you were to put in accommodations that remove that, issue with attention, there wouldn't be a learning issue present. So that's why I included this nearsighted one. People don't qualify for special education because they have vision problems. You get them glasses, they wear their glasses, and they're able to access the education. They can learn just fine. They just have different needs, and that falls into a different category. Well, that's a pretty good segue into 504. So Section 504 is governed by Individuals with Disabilities Act, and it's a civil rights compliance thing. So the purposes of the 504 plans is to provide equal access. So like the example with the glasses, that child needs something to access the education the same as others, but it doesn't mean they have a learning disability. A student with epilepsy might need special time to step out of the classroom to receive medication, or some grace if they have their seizure or something like that. But you know, they're not having a learning disability, but they do have things that can get away into their education, and that may require a plan to address so that they have equal opportunity. Now, to get a 504, it does require that you have some sort of condition that affects a major life activity, attention, reading, communicating are some examples. There's a whole list. Generally, most medical diagnoses, if they're interfering with learning, can qualify for a 504 plan. There isn't a requirement that specifically affects learning. And again, it's governed by the Individuals with Disability Act. Now, a special note on 504 is that a 504 is a legally binding document. So anything you put in a 504 is just as binding as an IEP. That's one thing that's a little different than some of the other plans you might run into in the general education. It's sort of the spot right before you would get to an IEP. They don't have a learning disability, but they do have a disability. So if you have a plan to address it, you are required to follow it. Brief note is that a school does have some power to determine how it meets a disability, how it meets an access issue. Just because somebody qualifies for a 504 doesn't mean they get to dictate how their need is met. So within 504, it's also important to note that a lot of times 504 students can piggyback off special ed services, meaning that if you have a student receiving some special intervention and they're on an IEP and there happens to be a 504 student that can benefit from the same intervention, they can receive that service at the same time. But it's important to note that 504s aren't intended for curriculum modifications. They are designed for accessing curriculum. So, you know, moving somebody up close, enlarging print, those are good examples, but providing an alternate curriculum is not appropriate for a 504. 504 is still part of the general education, and the things that you do are to access the general education. You shouldn't be doing an alternative curriculum or a whole different type of instruction. You shouldn't be doing those things. Accommodations and different things, all entirely appropriate. But it's important to note that 504s are different than an IEP, and what they're meant to do to allow the child to receive a good and appropriate education are different. So with that, I'll move into health plans. Health plans are a subcategory under 504, so they're governed also under the Americans with Disabilities Act and are primarily anti-discrimination based, providing access to education. So what makes a health plan a little different than a 504 is that it's more of a safety plan. For example, if you have a student that suffers from seizures, you might need a plan in place for what happens when they do suffer from a seizure. You know, where do you keep the medicine? Who is trained to deliver it? That sort of thing. It might not have that much to do with education. It has more to do with, you know, how are you going to manage their health? I think I've heard the term care plans before too, and I've been given different advice. Once upon a time when I wrote health plans, I'd call them health plans. I didn't call them 504 plans, and I've been told since then to make sure I call them 504 and then sub health plans. At the moment, that's what I would recommend, still referring to them as a 504 plan, but referring to them specifically as a health plan under that type. So again, health plans are different than 504s because they may not directly impact education, such as a student having diabetes, but there is a need to manage it, and there are some things you need to do so the student can participate in school regularly and be healthy in doing so. Now, keep in mind, these are legally binding documents, just like, straight up 504 or an IEP, and they represent what the school has said that they're going to do in the event of this specified health emergency. So if you do write a health plan and you don't do what's in it, you're liable. Now, on the same token, if you know a student has a health condition that needs a specific reaction and you don't write a health plan, you're also liable. So it's best to have one and to follow it, because if you have a health plan on file and it's current and whatnot, and you follow it, and something, God forbid, bad happens, that does cover your butt a little bit in that sort of situation. The other thing about a health plan is you might get input from a doctor or a nurse or have somebody like that on your team when you update it. So they provide a little bit of input. I do recommend that if it's a more serious health condition, that you see if parents would sign off on having some input from the doctor, maybe even being a part of the meeting when you write it up. So I'll move on to title programs. So we're kind of moving away from the legally binding documents now and more on schools' faith and effort put into it. But these at-risk categories still are monitored, and data is collected to make sure that you are doing what you need to. So title programs, there's a school-wide and there's targeted. School-wide would be more of a general education support because it's given to all students. You might have time set aside, or you block time for all students, whatever it is. There's no requirement to get in, so it's more of a general ed support, while other title schools are targeted, which that makes it an at-risk program, and generally speaking, you have to qualify under more than one standardized measure as being below grade level. And then the service is not provided to all students. Now, Title I falls under federal funds, so you're not allowed to use federal. You do get dollars for Title I, but you're not allowed to use federal dollars in order to, or you can't supplant curriculum, you can only supplement it. So that means you can't use your title dollars to hire an extra teacher to teach all students. You could hire one to deliver specific instruction, but it has to be in addition to the regular curriculum. So that's another aspect that makes it at risk. Even if it is school-wide, it's supposed to be in addition to what you already have. And these students may or may not qualify for special education. And again, it's targeting typically that at-risk category. Now, the other aspect of Title I, since it's in the federal category, the people who deliver the title services primarily are required to have qualifications. Now, those qualifications tend to vary depending on the legislative year, and they tend to go back and forth, so I won't really get into that, but the teachers and paraprofessionals are required to have special requirements in order to be delivering title services. So that's another important aspect of that. So with that, I'll move into I'm going to lump these all together: RTI, MTSS, BLAST, whatever the name is. I have found that these things like to change their acronyms periodically, and sometimes they just change the acronym to, say it's new and shiny. But generally speaking, these are all general education interventions. They represent good faith efforts upon the part of the school. So like if you see an MTSS plan, for example, it's not a legally binding document. There isn't a recourse if the school's not following it, so to speak. I mean, certainly you want to be doing that, and it looks bad if you're writing up plans but you're not following them. But they're not governed under law. There's no federal dollars, state dollars attached to it. So there isn't a monitoring system outside of the school itself, like with federally funded programs or special education. Now, Typically, a lot of these may have tiers, as you see over there. They can have different focuses, and a lot of times, sometimes having different focuses, that's where you get the different acronyms from. So you might have an intervention system that just focuses on behavior or just on intervention. Sometimes they keep them separate, sometimes they combine them. Sometimes you'll see this diamond shape instead, and what that means is they're treating students both above and below grade level. So these types of interventions may include your high flyers, so to speak, not to be confused with a gifted or talented program, as there isn't like strict guidelines to participate, but generally they would be looking at data for that. Now, these the primary place these interventions are occurring are in the classroom. So a lot of times teachers don't realize that, particularly on that tier 1. So if they're moving students in front of the classroom, providing visual and verbal prompts and different things, there's a lot of stuff they do within the classroom that is considered a general education accommodation. And so, sometimes schools looking at adopting an MTSS or RTI model or similar things, sometimes teachers look at that as, they're taking on more work because, it's not something you can send somebody to. It's not a time of the day in which students go get support. But it's one of those things, if you put in effort up front, it pays dividends on the backside. So I'll get a little bit more into that on the next slide. But these aren't what I'm what this category is. I'm not referring to specific block of time. So you don't MTSS a kid, you don't RTI a kid. It's a system that you have in place, and you might have blocks of time, such as win time, what I need, for example, in which you give students support. But these are all general ed. Now, MTSS and different things might have higher tiers in which you do have pullouts, and maybe you're involving some specialists in your school and delivering targeted instruction. And then it kind of gets into a gray area with at risk. But a major portion, that's why they use this pyramid, the major portion of your interventions are occurring there in the classroom. And if a student, the purposes of these plans are to get the student off them, so they need a little extra support to get on grade level, get their behavior in order or whatever it is. They're not designed to be a permanent plan. So usually if a student is remaining on an MTSS plan for an extended period of time, you start looking at qualifying for 504s or an IEP. Now, in the event of a 504, it probably won't look any significantly different. You're just kind of acknowledging that that student needs that continued support. But again, the structure of these is generally get the student back off them in some period of time. Again, these are a good faith effort upon the part of the school. So with that, I'll move into some basics of having a good intervention program. As I said, I've been a MTSS coordinator for 8 years, and in that time I've helped restructure one school's MTSS program, at the time RTI, and I started implementing it in my current district. So a lot of times when you go to the trainings for these different programs, they can seem very overwhelming because these schools are that have been doing it for 5-10 years, have all these things in place. But really, at its heart, a good intervention program is a problem-solving process. So you collect data to find out who needs help. You come up with a plan. So in these, you develop a team, you put your heads together, you come up with interventions that you can put in place that will help get that student up to speed. And then you collect the data to see if those are working, and if they are or aren't, you make adjustments. And if you see, now this is a bit more new, but like particularly with the MTSS model, if you see reoccurring themes going through your intervention system, you address those with the general ed curriculum. Like I said, it should be meeting 80% of your students' needs. Now, as I said before, sometimes people look at adopting one of these as more work, another thing you have to do. But I would really like to pitch out there, putting that work in ahead of time really pays. Some people, now if you catch problems early, generally it's a lot easier to get students up to speed. a lot easier to address the problem versus when it gets several years down the road and then you try to go through special ed because the student's several grade levels behind. They may or may not qualify. So MTS does a few things. One, catches problems early. It actually generally reduces referrals to special ed, and it makes the referrals you do have more successful because currently you can use MTSS data and those similar things in an IEP referral to show that you've been providing supports and you're not seeing the progress from the supports. Now, so the reason I say that is that these aren't like funneling systems for IEPs. They can be used within the process to make it better, to get that special ed process better. And I highly recommend involving your special ed teachers in the team meetings for these things. But if it's done right, it'll actually should reduce the needs that you have because they're caught early and they're fixed early. And more of the students you have entering special education should have a genuine learning disability versus those things I talked about that aren't really a learning disability, that the student just has different needs. Now, when doing MTSS plans, RTI plans, whatever you have, I do want to briefly say it's important to make sure you're doing those with fidelity. That's one of the good reasons to have meetings, get together, that sort of thing, because sometimes we make plans, particularly I see this in behavior plans. We try it once, it didn't work, so we throw it to the wayside and say, well, I tried that. Well, by having a plan and kind of specifying what it is you're going to try to do, you can see if it's working, but you can also hold each other accountable, like, are you actually following the plan? There's a lot of times, and this includes special ed plans, we put a plan together and it's a good plan, but we come back to the meeting, we're not seeing progress. But when we start asking ourselves, well, are we doing these things? The answer is sometimes no. And you know, it could be for various reasons. Perhaps you didn't think of certain things that you needed to get it done, you don't have enough time in the day, or other difficulties. But that's one of the first questions, if the intervention worked, that you need to ask. Did you actually do it? Did you put enough time into it? Did you give it enough time to work? If those things aren't true, you really can't say that the data is saying it's not working or it's working. So just an important plug there. So I'm going to end on English language learners. Now, I would consider this an at-risk category, and students that qualify may also receive special education services, but the requirements are different. They're not specifically related to having like a learning disability. It's that your language isn't up to speed because you have a different home language, for example. Now, schools should be doing some sort of home language survey in order to identify students that have English language learner needs, also to make sure that their students running into MTSS, special education and stuff, that their needs aren't because of having a second language, it actually is because they have a learning need or something like that, or you know, that your interventions are inappropriate because they're not addressing the issue of being a language learner, they're looking at it as a reading problem or whatever it is. These are governed under Title III, so they have similar rules to Title I as far as not supplementing and supplanting. You do require a specialist to be a part of that ILP and to provide services. That can look different for some of us smaller schools. You might run some of those interventions through an MTSS program or things like that, or send somebody to a specialist for additional education. The ILPs are a plan, and like the other plans, you should be following them. In order to get into an English language learner program, you need to go through the access testing. So there is that gatekeeping criterion. It's not as stiff as special education, so that's why I would say this is more of an at-risk category. And there is an expectation that these students will move towards a level of mastery in which they no longer need an ILP. So, I mean, you have that goal with special education too, but with English language learner plans, it is kind of embedded into the structure that these students in a certain amount of time should be achieving proficiency and not needing the plan anymore. So in that way, it has some commonalities with like the structure of like an MTSS or an RTI. It's a get them back into the full general education curriculum. So wrapping it up, we got the 3 categories. I consider general education and special education to be the 2 major ones, with at-risk programming doing a good job describing kind of that middle ground in between that large, serving everybody and serving the ones that have specialized needs and need special accommodations. Now, what I would like to end this with is it's a good idea to have an understanding of what these different systems are and what their purposes are. And I highly recommend incorporating stuff into your school structure so that they communicate. So for example, if you have a title program and an ELL program and a MTSS program, and they each operate independently, and they're trying to address a specific student's need, and they're in all 3 programs, sometimes what you'll see is that the student's being retaught the same things that one program is already doing. Where if you have that communication and that understanding between the different entities, the MTSS can target this skill, the ELL can target this skill, and the special education can work on these goals. And they're not being redundant, they're not overlapping in ways that are inefficient, and they're complementing and supporting one another rather than kind of competing. So that's one reason I'm an advocate of MTSS. That does a pretty good job of getting all the parts together. And if you understand this better, you also, with the special education referrals, you understand when a referral is needed and why. It can be, as I said, very frustrating for a parent to go through a special ed process. They're seeing a student have a very clear need. Maybe they have a very high level of attention deficit disorder, maybe severely dyslexic, but because their cognitive ability and their performance are, pretty much where they're supposed to be, they won't qualify. But that's not the same as saying they don't have a need. So hopefully you got something out of this presentation. I hope you understand better what all these acronyms are and how they relate. Hopefully your school has a way of making sure they all communicate and operate well together. And quick check, if you were paying attention, you probably noticed a change of background and clothing, as this is 2 separate recordings. So with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and take care, have fun, stay healthy.